Andrea. You're a psychologist and neuroscientist by training. I'm curious if you're at a dinner party somewhere, how do you describe your work and what you do?
So, hi, Patrick. I am a researcher at the University of Chieti Pescara in Italy, in South Italy. And I mostly focused my research on the psychophysiological effects of slow breathing practices, then moving to the effects also of meditation, of meditative and contemplative practices. And now in my research, I'm more focusing on the effects of interoception and interoceptive signals arriving from the body to the brain. Especially, I'm more interested in the effects of breathing and breathing phases and breathing frequency on brain activity and consequently on brain functioning.
Amazing. If I may ask, what sparked your fascination with this topic in the beginning?
So my fascination in the topic started at the university when I first got in touch with the so-called neuroscience of consciousness and the study of the neural correlates of consciousness. At the time, I was practicing different kind of meditation by myself without any guide. And then later, I discovered that these meditation practices were already studied in neuroscience as a neuroscience field, which is called contemplative neuroscience. And when I discovered mindfulness-based practices and research on that, and I was really interested in merging consciousness studies with meditation practices and how they relate to each other. So briefly, how meditation can induce non-ordinary states of consciousness.
What was the main finding in the end from that? How can mindfulness basically alter the state of consciousness?
So yes, mindfulness and meditation can really modulate the so-called ordinary state of consciousness, and they do it by modulating brain activity and connectivity in different brain networks. In particular, the most studied one is the default mode network, which is related to spontaneous mind wandering and to different self-related functions that are indeed related to our self, in particular to our narrative self. So the ability that has mindfulness and meditation to reduce the activity and connectivity within this network can be related to the ability to stay focused in the present, in the so-called present moment, here and now, but also to bodily sensations. So the ability of meditation to bring our consciousness back to bodily sensations and particular to breathing sensations.
Super interesting. How much, because I think you looked into the idea of breathing actually being a key factor of the mindfulness practice. At least with myself, I've noticed even though in many traditions, when you say mindfulness, your job is not to change your breathing, and yet you kind of do anyway, because you just, look at it and it starts calming down. How much do you think of the impact of mindfulness is actually the breathing rhythm changing, and how much is it like something else?
So it's very interesting but also complex question. Mindfulness practice and meditation practices indeed modulate breath frequency. They reduce breath frequency automatically when people focus their attention on breathing. But in mindfulness based practices, the idea is to just becoming aware of the breathing pattern without modulating, without so the ability to observe the object as breathing as an anchor, to observe it without modulating it, is itself one of the tools to develop some kind of meta awareness. In this case, the awareness of breathing. While on breathing techniques, the idea is to reduce breath frequency up to a certain rhythm and to maintain it. And this has another kind of correlate related to it. In particular, the reduction of breath frequency is able to modulate the activity of our autonomous nervous system, and our parasympathetic nervous system dominance will increase when we reduce breath frequency. But to reduce breath frequency, we need focused attention, which should be focused on a single object. So maybe the two mechanisms will overlap in the brain, in particular brain areas which are interoceptive, so brain areas that are related to the receiving and interpretation of bodily sensation.
I believe in 2018, you published this review, How Breath Control Can Change Your Life, right? What was the key thesis of that article?
So in that review, we were interested in finding the correlates of slow breathing practices, the psychophysiological correlates of breathing practices, including neurophysiological effects as measured with the neuroimaging techniques like EEG or functional magnetic resonance imaging. But also we wanted to find the correlates at the cardiovascular level, in particular the cardiac dynamics like heart rate variability, and respiratory sinus arrhythmia. And finally, we wanted to see whether the changes in one or both of these physiological components were related to a psychological outcome, which, for example, reduction of negative emotions, increase of positive emotions like joy, etc., and also to cognitive effects like the improved ability to focus attention. So basically, we found that we had a bit of difficulty in finding papers that together show modulation at the physiological level and also at the psychological level. This was quite surprising for us. But we were able to select some of them, and we found that slow breathing practices were able to modulate brain areas and brain functions related to focused attention. Like we found an increase of EEG alpha power, and also an increase in the activity of prefrontal regions that are both related to the ability of top-down focused attention. And then we show also that slow breathing practices were able to increase heart rate variability. So in particular in the high frequency range, which is commonly related to a dominance of the parasympathetic nervous system, so like a relaxation of the arousal, a reduction of the physiological arousal. And finally, these features were related to positive outcomes at the behavioral and psychological level, like a reduction of anxiety, a reduction of the experience of stress, and an increase of positive emotion, and also an increase of subjective ability of focusing attention.
And did it come down to reducing the breathing rate, or was there other factors when it comes to breathing that made this possible to have
We
more positive emotions?
we focused on the researches that showed a reduction of breath frequency. We selected those studies that used slow breathing practice, like we considered slow breathing as all the breathing frequency below 9 BPMs, below 9 breath per minute. And so we were focusing on that. So slow breathing technique explicitly discussed in the instructions of the participants. But I wanted to say also that we were surprised to find no mention of the fact that almost in 100% of studies, those studies included nasal breathing, slow nasal breathing, and not slow mouth breathing. And we asked ourselves whether this breathing pathway, so within the nostril, was related to the observed outcomes, both at the neurological but also at the psychological component of the outcome. And another aspect that we didn't find in the literature was very interesting, was no mention of the state of consciousness as subjectively reported by participants. So it is commonly known from centuries, especially from the Eastern traditions, that slow breathing and also meditation, but also slow breathing that are called pranayama breathing, pranayama practices, are related to non-ordinary state of consciousness or meditative states of consciousness. And we were surprising to find no study in Western literature 18 that studied explicitly this. So the non-ordinary state of consciousness is induced by breathing. So that's why we did other two studies on that healthy participants after this revision, after the literature.
There's a lot of directions we could go from here, but let me maybe follow up or double click on the nasal breathing, because I remember reading in one of your papers, you mentioned this mechanoreceptors in the nasal vault. And I think so far, like if you listen to people like Patrick McEwen or Andrew Huberman, they talk about nasal breathing from the point of view of warming up the air, making it more moist, and also avoiding overbreathing, which is much more easy to happen when you're breathing through your mouth. But it feels like you're pointing to a little bit different side, which is that you kind of somehow influence the brain directly. Can you just talk more about the mechanism here and what's actually happening when we breathe through our nose?
Yes, there was an hypothesis started in the 40 Nobel Prize Adrian about the possibility that stimulating the olfactory epithelium in animals is able to induce modulation of brain activity as well in areas not related to olfactory sensations. So this was demonstrated by Fontanini and colleagues in 2003 and in rats. And basically they show that stimulating the nostrils of a rat with a specific pattern of odorless air was able to induce a peak in power in the same frequency in different brain areas of the animal, like in the olfactory primary cortex, but also in the entorhinal cortex, and also in the somatosensory brain areas. And now we know that this mechanism is made possible by some mechanoreceptors that are located inside the nostrils in the olfactory epithelium, just below the olfactory bulb. And these receptors respond to air pressure, even in the absence of odors. They just respond when we breathe in. Of course, when we breathe in through the nose. So they transduce this information, this mechanic information, to the olfactory bulb. And then from the olfactory bulb, they transmit this at the prefrontal brain areas, in particular at the orbitofrontal cortex. And from there, there is the possibility that this pattern, which usually is a frequency pattern and it depends on the frequency of breathing, there is this possibility that this pattern is then transmitted from the frontal areas to the posterior brain areas. So in brief, it's entirely possible, and it has been most of the time demonstrated in animals and also in humans, that breathing at a specific frequency through the nose is able to modulate the frequency of oscillation in different brain areas that are not related at all to breathing or to olfactory processing, but are related to different other functions like executive functions, but also perceptual functions. So this is really interesting how we breathe in through the nose is able to modulate our brain and our perception. And this is not in theory, we are just investigating this. This is not the case when we breathe through the mouth. So this mechanism is not present, of course, because the air does not pass anymore through the nostril.
Fascinating. Do you have any hypothesis of what might be the consequence then? You mentioned like the executive function. I guess then the assumption might be that if you breathe in a low frequency through the nose, then your executive function performs better. Is that the hypothesis or something else?
I don't think there is much research on
Right.
focusing on the frequency of breathing, and in particular by differentiating nasal breathing from mouth breathing at a specific low frequency. But I think there is a lot of research on breathing phase and breathing pathway, like in the differentiation between inhalation and exhalation when we breathe through the nose and through the mouth. And here we have a lot of data showing that inhalation is able to modulate some brain functions, some neurocognitive function like visospatial, perceptual accuracy, and also emotional recognition. So the ability to recognize emotional faces faster when we breathe in through the nose than when we breathe into the mouth, for example. But then there is a lot of research on how respiratory phases are related to specific brain functions, and some functions maybe seems to be more facilitated by inhalation, when others seem to be more facilitated by exhalation, and more other functions seems to be facilitated by the transitions between phases. So the transitions between inhalation and exhalation and vice versa. So I think that studies focusing on slow breathing, comparing nasal and mouth breathing, we just did that when I was at the University of Pisa with the EEG, but I don't think it has been replicated in the literature yet.
Amazing. Yeah, I think there's a lot of research to be done around nasal versus mouth overall, even like at Alveus, where we're looking at if there's like any research around acoustically recognizing which one is happening based on acoustic signatures with spectrograms. And there's like literally like 2 papers, I think, out there that we could apply. So we're going to have to do a lot of the work ourselves. Fortunately, it does look like they have a little bit different signature acoustically. So we should be able to kind of differentiate between with our sensor. But yeah, a lot of work to be done there. One kind of area I wanted to delve into is the polyvagal theory. I believe, popularized by Stephen Porges. I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name. Porges, which I know you've done some work in. Maybe just to start off, how would you describe the polyvagal theory for someone who's doesn't know what it is?
So I don't think I am an expert in polyvagal theory because we never cited explicitly that in our works.
Hmm.
But what I can say is that there is this important focus given to the vagus nerve, which is the biggest nerve that we have in our body. which basically takes all information from different body organs and systems and transmits them to the brain, and also vice versa. Brain activity is able to modulate the functioning on our body and systems. The most common is the heart, and how the cardiac baroreceptor signals are sent to the brain, and consequently how the brain receives uh, pressure related information or information related to blood pressure, and consequently downregulate heart rate and heart and cardiac output, so stroke volume. And in particular, this is related to respiratory sinus arrhythmia. That's the reason why our heart increases its frequency when we inhale, and it reduces its frequency when we exhale. There is actually a theory which is related to how slow breathing, when we inhale deeply and exhale deeply, is able to trigger the activity of some stretch receptors, which are located around our lungs, which are normally not active when we breathe spontaneously in a shallow way and in a fast way. And this hyperactivity of these slowly adapting stretch receptors at the lung level acts like a specific vagal stimulation, bottom-up vagal stimulation, which is able to modulate also the activity in our higher order brain networks, like resting state networks, like the default mode network, and the task positive network, like frontoparietal network, etc., and also other attentional networks. So that's why slow breathing is able to stimulate vagal nerve activity, parasympathetic dominance, and in a bottom-up way is able to regulate resting state networks, which, by the way, are the same network which are also implied in mindfulness-based practices. So they are related to focused attention and reduced mind wandering. So that's
Hmm,
why they a bit overlap.
amazing. And is that the main, you think, like if you think about the mechanism of breathing or breath work practice techniques onto the nervous system, do you think that's the main mechanism of those sensors that are located around the lungs, or are there other ways that in which we kind of activate the vagus nerve and then hence influence the brain and the nervous system?
There is also, for sure, another which is very important, which is the increase of heart rate variability. So when we breathe in slowly and breathe out slowly, for the differences in pressure at the thorax level, we also have a deeper reduction in heart rate during exhalation and a faster increase in heart rate during inhalation. And this heart rate variability is also an index of how the cardiovascular system is able to adapt to contingent situations at the in our environment. And also there is an increase in this baroreceptor activity when we slow down our breath, so an increase also in interoceptive cardiac information arriving to our brain, which is also able to stimulate the interoceptive network. So these are two of the bottom up mechanisms which are related to slow breathing practices, but there is also another top down mechanism which is very important, and that is the ability to focus our attention to our breathing and to our bodily sensations, which is itself an interoceptive task. So it anchors us to our body and our bodily sensations. And this is another crucial aspect, which is, by the way, shared with meditation techniques. And then another mechanism which is related to the slow breathing practices is indeed the nasal pathway. So when we practice slow breathing through the nose, we are also able to modulate that higher level pathway starting from the olfactory bulb and going to the prefrontal areas.
So one thing I wanted to go deeper into is the interoception, which I believe you've done some research around. I mean, as far as I understand, you have exteroception, where we look at the senses, like the eyes, the ears, like what's happening outside us. And then interoception is when we look inside, whether it's the breathing or something else. What have been some of the most interesting things you've learned when you've studied interoception of human beings?
So interoception for me was like the union point between meditative practices and also slow breathing practices, because in some way they both are related to our body and to our bodily sensations and to our bodily information. So when I moved to the university where I'm working now and started to study interoception, I was really interested in finding respiratory interoception related outcomes. And I delved deeper into the scientific literature about how respiratory signals, our respiratory interoceptive signals can modulate brain activity and also brain functions and cognitive and perceptual and emotional functions. And but I saw that most of the literature is related to how breathing is able to modulate the external perception of the world and also like emotions, visuospatial I was interested in finding how respiration can instead modulate the perception of our body. So it's a kind of interoceptive modulation of our interoceptive signals. So how respiratory phases are related to the perception of our body, because like in meditation practices, in slow breathing practices, there is people that there are people that report to being better able to anchor to their body during a specific respiratory phase. And in particular, as I found out later, this respiratory phase seems to be related to the exhalation phase and then to the transitions between exhalation and inhalation. So it seems that in these specific phases, our brain, our neurocognitive system should be better able to detect bodily sensation, and by extension, it seems that it should be related to higher bodily awareness during exhalation compared to inhalation. And so that's what we found here in our latest studies from 2022 to 2024. We showed that the perception of our heart, of our cardiac sensations, is improved when we exhale compared to when we inhale. And that was very interesting for me, because it seems that our breathing activity not only modulates how we perceive the world, but it also modulates how we perceive ourself, our bodily self in particular. So as a consequence, modulating breathing, this is just another proof that by modulating breathing, we can also modulate our mind body connections, our mind body relationships, which are related to health, of course, to psychophysiological health.
How do you think about that? Is it like a different sort of interoception? Because basically what you're describing is by breathing slower, you become more conscious of what's happening inside, particularly on the long exhale and in between the inhale and exhale. How do you think about the people that might actually not want that?
Okay. So the question is, it's very complex, and we still need studies and literature about that. But it seems that the interception should be located in the middle of a continuum, in the optimal position between very low interoception and very high, extremely high interoception. There are some psychological disorders, some psychopathologies like schizophrenia and major depression, which are related to a reduction of bodily awareness, of also interoceptive accuracy, interoceptive sensibility, and interoceptive awareness that should be related to that we may should try to improve in order to reduce some symptoms, because this is also related to the ability of regulating emotions, in particular negative emotions, which are present in these disorders. But on the other side, we also have um, anxiety-related disorders like panic disorders or social phobia or generalized anxiety, but also post-traumatic stress disorders that seems to be related to extremely high interoceptive sensibility that can be also misinterpreted by the subject, by the patient, and often in a catastrophic way. So we sort need to train this interoceptive sensibility, and we for sure need to develop personalized intervention, which can also be mindfulness and meditation related, and also related to slow breathing practices in order to optimize interoception and interoceptive skills in different disorders and of course in different people.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. So there's like a golden pathway between both ends, having X% of your awareness inside, but not too much. So you also keep in touch with what's going outside and not get stuck with your
Yes.
inner world. Based on everything you've studied now in terms of breath work, if you try to summarize them into protocols, and maybe we can almost take it from the point of view of different personalities and people having different objectives. Maybe we can start with someone who's high stress, they're in a difficult job, they're they almost like the nervous system in sympathetic state most of the day, which then comes out in different ways when it comes to their breathing patterns and so forth, which hopefully we can then pick up with the wearable. What would be the breathing protocol you would give them based on what you know?
So there will be many different ways of approaching, but in the case of a highly chronic stressed person, I will go for a slow breathing practice performed through the nose, both during inhalation and during exhalation. Mm, I have a bit of expertise in kind of breathing practices called squared breathing or
Hmm.
samavriti pranayama, which is related to uh, four breathing it is divided into four breathing phases like inhalation, pauses after inhalation, exhalation, and pause after exhalation. All four of them should have the same identical duration. Usually it should be around 5 to 6 seconds. So it will be like a very slow breathing practice around 4 BPMs. But also there is a lot of literature on a little bit faster breathing techniques called resonance breathing, which I think is around 6 to 7 breaths per minute. This is also very interesting. There is a lot of research by Lehrer and colleagues showing this resonance breathing to be related to higher parasympathetic improved functions. So I will try for this. But another possibility also will be to make a breathing technique which includes a longer exhalation compared to a slower inhalation, because during exhalation we have an increase of parasympathetic dominance. And I think there are some studies showing that increasing the exhalation duration compared to inhalation, so like the inhalation to exhalation ratio, is beneficial compared to the other way around, so to longer inhalation than exhalation. But unfortunately, I think that literature is really, really scarce about this specific aspect at the moment.
Perfect. Thank you for that. What about someone who instead of trying to get into this relaxed state, they actually want to focus. They maybe are care about performance. It could be someone in the workplace, it could be an athlete. Would you change
Mhm.
your recommendation on the protocol for them?
Maybe in people who already have hypersympathetic dominance, maybe we should try to go for a focused attention meditation practice instead, which is also known to be related to like a relaxed, alert state of consciousness. So it's just relaxed at the body level, but is highly alert at the brain level, in particular in the prefrontal brain areas at the task positive networks and etc. So maybe it should be the case to not to increase the parasympathetic dominance, which is already high, but try to go for more focused practice, like more focused attention meditation practices,
Mm,
or even to yoga practice and to more active states like yoga and dynamic meditation practices like Tai Chi, etc. So this could be also very important to activate the body, also at the muscular level, to which is also being related to improved cognitive functions. So that could be the case.
makes sense. Are there any other protocols that you've applied in your own life, perhaps, as you've learned more about breathing and its impact on our health and life?
Yeah, we did. We did some years ago a study in France when I still was a PhD student at the University of Pisa about a Nidra yoga retreat, so a Nidra yoga protocol, which was taught by a really expert master yogi called Andrea in France. And so we basically went there with one colleague of mine with the EEG, and we stayed together with them for 1 week long retreat a period, and we measured their brain activity and also their state of consciousness in these very long Nidra yoga sessions, which are performed in supine position. So it's like people go to sleep in that position, but instead they maintain um, kind of awareness of their sleep. So Nidra yoga is also called the yoga of sleep or the yoga of dreams. And it is a very deep meditative state of consciousness, which is very interesting and which I also practiced myself quite often at home, but also in that situation. And if you ask the participants of this specific form of yoga, they often tell you that their deepest state of consciousness, their unified state of consciousness, also called non-dual awareness states, is very highly related to periods of spontaneous apneas. So a period of the cessation of breathing at all. So the breath just stops for some seconds spontaneously without any effort. And in those seconds, they perceive like a non-dual state of awareness or like pure consciousness state. Yeah, consciousness without an object, just consciousness. And that is really, really interesting. And I think it should be studied more, that specific state of consciousness. But there is very few literature on Nidra Yoga, especially so deepest form of Nidra.
Yeah. At least seems like Huberman has been talking about this NSDR, non-sleep deep rest, which is based on Nigodra, and hopefully there'll be more studies on that, at least one form of it, of subform. Maybe speaking of research, is there anything that you think a little bit more cutting edge on things you're working on or want to work on? Like, what are the biggest unanswered questions that maybe about breathing in mind that keep you up at night or excited about things you want to delve into in the future?
One very interesting question that we are now asking, and it's a study that we are now performing, is the relationship between breathing and the first person experience in meditation. So we know that there is a lot of literature on trying to develop also not new methods to assess brain, sorry, to assess respiratory related brain activity. So how the frequency, and specifically how the phase of breath is related to the phase or amplitude of certain brain signals and specific brain areas. This has been done at rest. This has been done during specific exteroceptive tasks, but this has never been done during meditation. So if we really wanna, in my opinion, if we really we want to say that meditation is able to increase the link between the brain and breathing. So I think we need to start to develop some methodologies to assess uh, breathing related brain activity and how they change in meditation and how they are related to non-ordinary states of consciousness in participants. So that's what we are now trying to do in our latest research.
Wow, that is getting deep into what it is to be a human, basically. Yeah. Maybe on a similar point, the more I study the topic of breathing, the more you understand how it affects everything in terms of biological systems and brain states and everything else. Obviously, nervous system being a key one. I'm curious, like, if you think about beliefs that you have, but those that are probably not yet adopted by majority of the population or even the scientific community, what do you think are the beliefs you have that are maybe most unconventional when it comes to aspects of breathing and how it affects our systems and our health?
The most unexpected things to learn when delving into this topic was that breathing, how we breathe, is able to modulate the perception of the external world. Just the perception, just how we perceive things,
Go deeper.
but not how we breathe, not the frequency, but just the phase. So people, we don't know that when we do our stuff, our everyday life, we automatically and spontaneously modulate our breathing according to what we expect to perceive. So maybe if we expect to receive some kind of information from the external world, we just inhale. And if we are good at doing this, we perceive it better compared if we are not good to synchronize our body with the environment. So the degree in which we are able to synchronize spontaneously with the environment is just a very significant thing of how we're just able to behave in that. So this is very important. And of course, it is not very well demonstrated because it has been demonstrated just in very rigid experimental settings. But we believe that this should be also true in our complex everyday world and everyday life. And I think that nobody even suspect this. So people don't suspect that there is this possibility that our body is able to change so much how we perceive the world. And in particular, our breathing is able to modulate how we perceive the world. This is not suspected, I think.
Wow, that is quite a headline. I appreciate it. What about the opposite? I'm sure because you've worked with people in the world of yoga, breath work, and otherwise. What are some of the maybe misconceptions that people in the world have about breathing that you don't believe are quite rooted in evidence and might be like good to myth bust?
Sometimes we see that there are some ideas about breathing which are not really true. In particular, this is related to breathing techniques, breathing practices, and how they can be performed by people. And sometimes you see that these kind of techniques are thought to people maybe automatically or even online without the presence of the master or of the facilitator or the expert. And I think that breathing techniques, especially when they go deep, when they become really slow or even faster, because there are also breathing techniques that increase the breath frequency. I think that these kind of techniques should be learned really with care and with caution, and should be supervised by an expert person who is able to teach them. Because I don't think there is enough literature about the negative effects of learning these techniques in a bad way, but for sure there is some anecdotal evidence about the possibility to find some negative side effects of these breathing practices, especially when they are not learned correctly. And this should be very important. And another aspect is the idea, this overall idea that slow breathing can be considered a solution to our problems as a species or as a culture. In particular, could be considered a reduction of our stress as a whole, or our anxiety or depressive moods, etc. It isn't. It indeed has some positive effects that we are going to study, and already we already know some of them, but for sure it's not enough to solve all of our problems. It's not a panacea to everyone. And it should also be better personalized to specific people or to specific conditions. It's not one take all, or like a simple solution for every problem that we have. We need more research on that. We need more studies trying to find how we can personalize breathing practices, similar way what we said before, to increase, reduce breathing, to associate it with movement. Also, asanas in yoga, they are really related to breathing, but this is not very well known by common people. So we didn't share so much that asanas in yoga, in hatha yoga, is really related to the ability to focus and our breathing and also to control it. So there could be very, very different ways of approaching this. But for sure it should be personalized, and we should also pay attention to positive side effects.
Yeah. Yeah. It's sometimes the nuance is lost when you go on the social media and you have like, oh, do this for this impact, and you lose the nuance of like, hey, yes, it works for, I don't know, 70% of people, but then there is those 30% for whom it's not the ideal solution. Having the nuance of, as you mentioned, personalization, and then not understanding the side effects for many people can be crucial. Is there any area of your research that we haven't covered and you feel might be worth going into before we start wrapping up, Andrea?
I think that we didn't talk about some kind of research that I did on meditation, in particular, very expert meditators. When I still was in Pisa, we performed a study on Vipassana meditation,
Hmm.
which is very interesting. It's a very interesting practice, but we were focusing on really expert monks, so not common people, not novices or naive or meditation naives. But yeah, I think we can also skip this because we still don't have solid results with that kind of study. So maybe I don't know if it's a case. We just have some conference papers, some conference results, but not nothing published yet.
If you're comfortable talking about it, I would love to hear what are some of the potential learnings you have, at least from studying the monks.
So first of all, we found that it's very hard for a very expert meditator to not going into a spontaneous meditative state. So it's almost impossible to just relax and rest, which is commonly considered as a counter condition for meditation in research. So you have your meditation and you have your counter condition, and usually, and not always correctly, this counter condition is just rest, just mind wandering. But in these very expert monks, mind wandering is almost impossible, and they just go deep into into meditative states almost spontaneously. So they reduced the effort to go into that meditative state thanks to their practice experience. But interestingly, we found when we investigated their first person experience after the meditation, so we administered some questionnaires, which are called retrospective psychometric questionnaires that are related to the experience they had during the meditation. Their experience was, of course, deeper, but in some way very similar to the pranayama breathing experience that we recorded in another study. So basically, these participants, and I think the most striking first person experience they reported was just this effect of losing their body boundaries in a way, just like their body was almost dissolving and merging into the space, into the room, or even into the universe. So there was the lack of this distinction, which is so deep that we have in our everyday life between our self and the word, so the non-self. And in particular, at the deepest level, we have this bodily self that can be dissolved into the deepest meditative states of consciousness. And this is very important because I think this is one of the first steps before reaching a kind of non-dual state of awareness, which is also related to enlightenment or also samadhi states, which are commonly reported into the Eastern traditions of yoga and of also Buddhism, etc. So this was very interesting to find at the first person level this kind of commonly reported experience of losing our body, which is very interesting.
And what do you think mechanistically is happening? Is it the default mode network in our brain shutting down and then we kind of don't know anymore that we're us? Or what do you think is happening mechanistically there?
I'm just coming. We have few research on that, of course, but one of the possibility is the increase of the global connectivity between resting states network that commonly are not related to each other, but they work like in a modular way. So there is this reduction of modularity in our brain networks, and the increase of the global connectivity. And this should be also related to the lack of distinctions between self and other. This has been reported not so many times, but sometimes in deeper states of meditation, like non-dual meditation, and interesting also in experiences of ego dissolution that are commonly found in the psychedelic states. So when people take
Uh-huh.
psychedelic substances, and they have these very deep, non-ordinary states of consciousness induced by the psychedelic states. I think there are some studies that show this reduction of anti-correlations between networks, so an increase of the correlations between them that are related to also the loss of bodily sensation and again the distinctions between self and others.
Hmm. It is fascinating how, in a way, there are multiple ways to get to the same place. You mentioned the psychedelics, but also the vipassana, which ultimately is just like paying deep attention to what's happening. And then I recently interviewed someone who's a breathwork facilitator, and they were talking about the doing like deep conscious breathing in a very kind of deep way, very quite fast. And obviously, you might know, but like doing that kind of breathing techniques basically get you to the same place in typically like 15 minutes or less. And and the end state seems to be very similar across those three modalities. So there's something interesting where something is being affected in the brain to get us to the state where we don't lose sense of our body and ourselves. But yeah, that's probably a beautiful place to start closing in. Andrea, of course, people can search for your name and find all the work you do. Is there any specific location where you want to point people to if they want to learn more about the work?
I think that they can look for, if they're interested in going deeper into the research that we published. There is my ResearchGate page, which is a common social network used by people into research. They can just look for my name and also download. I think all the papers that we published are open access, so they can download them for
It's
free, the
amazing.
PDF, and read them.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for your time and really interesting insights, as well as the work you do. I think it's, as you mentioned, very much understudied. And hopefully, we can give tools for people that can use, because ultimately breathing is free tool that everyone can apply in their life. And as you mentioned, there's so many ways in which we can impact in a positive way. So if we learn more about what are the different modalities and the ways it works, it can probably guide us into like designing optimal programs for different types of people. So very much looking forward to seeing all the work you do and going forward. But for now, thank you for your time, and for everyone listening, thanks for tuning in. I'll see you all later on.
Thank you very much, Patrick. See you soon. Thank you.
See you soon.